What up, y'all? It's Greek, it's Tutorial Tuesday, and today we're talking about how to reverb. Reverb is just a fancy way of saying echo, but there's a lot of different ways to have echo in music, so you had to give different terms. And so one of those is reverb, short form, reverberation. Whenever you are in a room and you got a microphone and walls and a ceiling and a floor, when you talk or an instrument talks, makes noise, it's gonna shoot sound out in all different directions. It's gonna bounce off everything in the room and then come back to the mic and keep doing that over and over. Depending on the size of the room that you're in and the shape, the bouncing of the signal everywhere across the room is gonna be different. One of the most famous drum samples of all time is from Led Zeppelin, When the Levee Breaks. And when they initially recorded the drums for that, they actually went into the staircase of a high school just to get the proper reverb on the sound that they wanted. That's kind of how powerful reverb is, by really taking that recording and making it, the perfect amount of reverb with it, again, made it one of the most popular drum samples of all time. Now, luckily, in the modern era, we don't have to rely on just natural reverb. There's a bunch of digital processors that allow you to create reverb for different instruments and things like that. We're just going to go over FL Studio's reverb to show you how to add that to your beats and make your beats better and have more control over your sound. All right, so the main purpose of reverb is to do one of two things, either to fill space or to make depth. And I'll explain what both of those mean. Both are kind of concepts that have to do with the mixing process. If you have a beat that has a lot of space or silence between different sounds, then one thing people do is actually add reverb to kind of help fill that silence. So the echo that comes from the reverb just helps fill out the sound of the beat a little bit better. And then in terms of making depth, whenever you mix a track and you have all the different sounds going on, you got your samples, you got your VSTs, you got all your different melodies, you got your kick, your snare, your hat, and all your different drums and perks and whatever you got going on, you don't want all of them playing at the same level. It's just too much. So one thing that you do is make some sounds louder than other, basically. One thing sound engineers have come to realize to make the sounds more rich is not looking at just the mix in a one-dimensional, either loud or soft. They almost look at it as like a three-dimensional type problem where you can actually add depth to your mix as well. Basically, what reverb allows you to do is it makes things sound like they're farther off in the distance. And so you have some of the instruments that are a little bit more dry and louder right up in your face. And then you have some instruments that add a different kind of texture to your beats. And by adding reverb on them, it makes them sound like they're farther off in the distance, which just really gives the overall mix a really good feel. And so I got this little simple beat pulled up here that I was messing around with. And so we'll just use this for our reference when we go through the reverb. Me personally, what I typically use reverb on the most is the snare. And so let's go ahead and pull this up. We'll go over all these different knobs and stuff right here. So let's start over here. Here's kind of like the main knobs that you want to use. The dry signal is, all right, so the snare makes a sound. It goes into the reverb. Whatever sound goes into the reverb, that is the dry signal. So if we just turn the reverb off completely, just the regular snare sample is the dry sound without any reverb on it. And then the wet is basically how much of the reverb are you putting on it. So if you put it all the way up, kind of hear that echo. If we turn it all the way down, obviously. And this middle one here is ER, stands for early reflection. And the early reflection is just basically how fast the sound is bouncing off the wall and coming back to the microphone. I mean, sound's going to travel at the same speed regardless, so I think a better way to think about it is almost kind of like, it's kind of like the size of the room that you're in. Because if you're in a bigger room, it's going to take longer for the sound to the bounce and come back. And the early reflection isn't necessarily the whole reverb, the whole echo, it's just the early part of it. So that's kind of what that is. Over here, we got the high cut and the low cut, and this is basically for the reverb itself, not necessarily the instrument that you have coming in. I mean, if you are familiar with like subtractive EQ and filters and stuff like that, you'll understand high cut and low cut. And so with the low cut, this is just basically how much of the low end that's coming through, and then with the high cut, how much of the high cut is coming through, or how much of the high end is coming through. The delay is just basically the time that the sound hits and then when the reverb starts. And so you can actually match it up with the tempo and create some weird sounds. The size, this is more, I kind of talked about this with early reflection, but the size, this is the actual size of the room that you're in. These other three here, I mean, I could go over them if people want to, but to be honest, I never use them, so I'm just going to skip those. Same with this bass multiplier right here. Different way to control the low end of the actual reverb. I usually just cut it all out in most of my beats because I want to clear the low end. And my theory with mixing beats is I want to clear out all the low end sound from any other instruments other than my kick drum and my bass or 808. So I usually just leave it as is or just get it out completely. Now this is the last knob that I would say is the most important. This is the decay. This is basically just how long the reverb is going to last. And up in the top left part of the screen, whenever you turn the knob, it'll show you how many seconds there are. And basically, it's how many seconds until it goes to like negative 60 dB, I think it is. Again, the amount of time doesn't matter. You have to use your ear to make sure it sounds good with everything. I mean, knowing all the definitions of these knobs aren't important, but knowing how they affect the reverb is probably the most important part. The last one here that I don't typically use a lot, just because I use reverb on a lot of my beats, but I don't make it sound like one big echo or anything like that. But it's the stereo separator. Allows you, so we talked before about making, depth to your sound. The separator adds width to your sound. And so let's say you have multiple instruments that have reverb on them. You can use the stereo separator here to maybe have one, be at 0 and then another one kind of spread out and make it wider in the stereo. That way they don't overlap as much. And with the perceived sound, you can kind of still hear both of them. But I don't know. If you're using that much reverb on all this stuff, then I don't know. To me, not my taste. And then also up here is a bunch of presets of different types of rooms. We got the cathedral, we got the drum room, we got the large hall, small studio, the venue. And then I made my own custom one right here. So the cool thing about the reverb and pretty much every plugin that you have in FL Studio is if you have it on the side channel right here, you can just click and go to Save Preset As. And so if you ever are just, making hundreds and hundreds of beats and you finally get that, one beat that's perfect and the reverb is perfect on it, you can just save the setting on that. That way you don't have to go back in and keep readjusting stuff all the time. I mean, if you got your reverb sound down the way you want to use that for multiple beats, I mean, hell, why not? Or maybe you have a bunch of different types of reverb. Depending on the tempo of your song, if you have a slower tempo song, you can have longer tails of reverb because it's just a longer time frame until other sounds come up. If you have a more up-tempo song, then you don't want your reverb to be too long, because the one thing you definitely want to avoid when you are doing reverb is if that reverb, the decay time is too long and then you have instruments keep hitting, the reverb is going to start to overlap each other, and it's going to make your mix and your sound real muddy and not as clear. So definitely be careful that you don't go too overboard with the reverb. And so things that I typically use reverb on are, like I said before, the snare drum, I'll use it a lot on different perks sometimes. Every once in a while, I'll use it on the actual main hi-hat that I use. But if I ever add different perks and stuff like that, maybe like a rim shot or an open hat or just other weird sounds that I might use, I usually don't make those particular sounds too loud, and I'll usually make those lower than maybe the snare and the kick in my mix. And so what I'll do is I'll add a little reverb onto some of the different perks to kind of add depth to those sounds, kind of make them sound like they're off in the distance and, you know, fill out the sound of the beat a little bit more. I'll definitely use reverb on samples. And once you get to understand the concepts of reverb a little bit better and get more practice with it, it's probably the best way to say it, then you'll notice a lot of the other different effects plugins that you use will have a reverb component in them. And the reason that's important is because I think a lot of time newer producers will rely just on the presets of a lot of these effect plugins and aren't able to unlock the full power of what a lot of these plugins can do. When I see people spending $100 and $200 on a reverb plugin when Fruity Loops already has one that can control every parameter of the reverb that you need, it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's a waste of money. I might be ignorant on this. Maybe there are reverbs out there that do things that this reverb can't, but the concept of reverb really isn't so complicated that the technology that Fruity Loops has doesn't have in some other, you know, reverb plugin. It's just sound bouncing off a wall, or making it sound like it at least. You can only make sound bounce off a wall so well, if you know what I mean. In my opinion, that's usually what people pay for when they're buying external reverb plugins. It's just they like all the presets and they don't want to go through the whole process of learning it yourself. And you know, maybe there's something to that, but in my opinion, it just makes you a weaker producer, because kind of like I said before, the concept of reverb will show up in other different plugins and sounds and stuff like that, and you want to have a knowledge of how to control that reverb so that get the sound that you want. Alright y'all, that's pretty much it for reverb. Again, helps fill in the space from silence in your beat and helps add depth to your beat as well. If you have any additional questions about reverb, definitely put those down in the comments. If anybody has any other information or insight on how to use reverb effectively for your beats, then please use them in the comments as well. I don't know everything, nor does anybody, so if you got some knowledge, definitely drop it on us. But other than that, I appreciate for everybody sticking around for Tutorial Tuesday. Hopefully it was helpful. If you got any questions about anything else that you want me to go over in the future, please let me know. Otherwise, it's a Greek Indian Hip Hop Beats, aka Greek, aka Dat Boy. Have a good one, y'all.